Crimson Desert Justice. Florence Florrie Tate had spent years running, but when a storm forced her into Ethan West's cabin, she realized she might have just run straight into more danger. He watched her from across the fire, his voice rough as the wind outside. "You got nowhere else to go, do you?" he murmured. "Reckon you'll be staying here, then." Chapter 1. The storm breaks, and the past unfurls. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the ragged edges of Florrie Tate's worn canvas cloak. Rain lashed down, turning the already treacherous mountain trail into a slick, muddy morass. She hunched lower over her horse, a weary mare named Bess, urging the animal forward with a gentle nudge of her heels. Visibility was near zero, the world a swirling vortex of gray and brown. Fear, cold and sharp, gnawed at her insides. This storm was unlike anything she'd encountered in her years of drifting, a brutal, unforgiving tempest that seemed determined to swallow her whole. Florrie had been running for so long, the reasons why had become blurred, a tangled knot of pain and regret she couldn't bear to unravel. Each town, each fleeting face, was just another temporary haven, a brief respite before the relentless whispers of her past drove her onward. She'd left behind a life of comfort, a family name whispered with respect, all for a freedom that tasted more like ashes than liberation. Bess stumbled, nearly throwing Florrie from the saddle. The mare whinnied, a high-pitched sound of distress that was almost lost in the roar of the wind. Florrie clung to the reins, her knuckles white, her body aching with exhaustion. She had to find shelter, and soon. Hypothermia was a silent killer, and she'd seen its grim work firsthand. Through the driving rain, she saw it a faint, flickering light, a beacon in the overwhelming darkness. Hope, fragile as a newborn bird, fluttered in her chest. She urged Bess forward, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The light grew stronger, revealing the outline of a small, sturdy cabin nestled against the base of a towering rock face. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a promise of warmth and refuge. As she drew closer, she could make out more details. The cabin was built of rough-hewn logs, the windows shuttered tight against the storm. A small, covered porch ran the length of the front, offering some protection from the elements. A weathered rocking chair sat empty, swaying gently in the wind. It was a place built for solitude, a haven from the world. Florrie dismounted, her legs stiff and aching. She tied Bess to a sturdy post near the porch, offering the mare a reassuring pat. The horse nuzzled her hand, seeking comfort. Taking a deep breath, Florrie approached the cabin door. It was made of thick, dark wood, reinforced with iron bands. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the rough-hewn surface. What awaited her inside? Was this sanctuary or another trap? She knocked, the sound swallowed by the storm. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time, her knuckles rapping against the wood. Still nothing. Desperation clawed at her throat. She couldn't stay out here. She would die. She tried the latch. To her surprise, it turned. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The scent of wood smoke and something else, something indefinable but undeniably masculine, wafted out to greet her. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone home?" A figure emerged from the shadows at the back of the cabin. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with a slow, deliberate grace that spoke of both power and caution. He stopped a few feet away, his features obscured by the dim light. She could make out the glint of a rifle held loosely in his hand, pointed towards the floor, but ready. "Who's there?" His voice was a low rumble, roughened by the wind and something deeper, a weariness that resonated with her own. Florrie stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind her. The warmth of the cabin enveloped her, a welcome contrast to the biting cold outside. "My name is Florence Tate," she said, her voice gaining a little strength. I got caught in the storm. My horse and I need shelter." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes, dark and unreadable, taking in her soaked clothes, her wind-chapped face, the exhaustion etched in every line of her body. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the howling wind outside. Finally, he lowered the rifle slightly. "You're alone?" She nodded. "Just me and my mare." He gestured towards the fire with the barrel of the rifle. "Get warm. I'll see to your horse." Florrie hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to be wary. But she was too tired, too cold, to argue. She moved towards the hearth, the heat drawing her in like a moth to a flame. She sank down onto a rough-hewn stool, her body trembling with relief. As he turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of his face in the firelight. It was a hard face, weathered and lined, with a strong jaw and a mouth set in a grim line. A scar, pale and jagged, ran from his temple to his cheekbone. His eyes, though dark, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, not kindness, perhaps, but something akin to understanding. Or maybe it was just exhaustion playing tricks on her weary mind. He stepped out into the storm, disappearing into the swirling darkness. Florrie watched him go, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. She was alone, in a stranger's cabin, miles from anywhere. She had survived storms before, but this one felt different. This one felt like a turning point, a moment where her carefully constructed world of solitude was about to be irrevocably shattered. And the man who had just offered her shelter, he was a part of that storm, a force as wild and unpredictable as the wind itself. She had run so far, only to find herself trapped again. But this time, the trap felt different. This time, it felt almost inevitable. The fire crackled, a spark leaped, casting a dancing shadow of Ethan, or that is what she assumed was his name, upon the far cabin wall. It was the shadow of a protector, or a captor. She could not yet be certain. Chapter 2. Shelter in the heart of the hurricane. The door slammed shut with a resounding thud, cutting off the worst of the storm's fury. Florrie huddled closer to the fire, the warmth slowly seeping into her chilled bones. The cabin was small, one main room serving as both living area and kitchen, with a loft above accessible by a rough-hewn ladder. A narrow bed was tucked into a corner, partially hidden by a faded, patchwork quilt. The furniture was simple and functional, a sturdy wooden table, a couple of chairs, a worn leather armchair placed strategically near the hearth. Everything was meticulously clean and orderly, a stark contrast to the chaos raging outside. The scent of pine and wood smoke mingled with the fainter aroma of coffee and something else, a hint of leather and gunpowder, the lingering scent of the man who had gone out into the storm. It was a comforting scent, strangely familiar, evoking a sense of ruggedness and resilience. Florrie closed her eyes, letting the heat wash over her. She hadn't realized how utterly exhausted she was until this moment, the tension draining from her body, leaving her feeling weak and vulnerable. She listened to the wind howling outside, the rain drumming against the roof, the occasional crackle and pop of the fire. It was a symphony of wildness, a reminder of the unforgiving landscape that surrounded her. She opened her eyes and looked around the cabin, taking in the details. A collection of well-worn books lined a shelf above the fireplace, their titles hinting at a mind that sought knowledge and solace. A rifle, identical to the one he'd carried, hung on pegs above the door, a silent testament to the need for self-reliance in this harsh land. A half-finished carving of a hawk, its wings outstretched in flight, lay on the table, alongside a sharp, well-honed knife. The details spoke of a life lived on the edge, a life of solitude and quiet strength. The door opened again, and he stepped inside, shaking the water from his thick, dark hair. He'd shed his heavy coat, revealing a worn denim shirt that stretched taut across his broad shoulders. He carried a bucket of water, which he placed near the hearth. "Your mare's settled," he said, his voice still low and rough.
"Found some oats in the shed. She'll be fine."
"Thank you," Florrie replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I appreciate it." He nodded, his gaze sweeping over her again, assessing, but not unkind. "You're soaked through. There are some blankets in that chest." He gestured towards a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. "Get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." Florrie hesitated, a flicker of unease returning. She was alone with this stranger, a man who exuded an aura of quiet danger.
But she also knew he was right.
She couldn't stay in her wet clothes. She rose, her legs still shaky, and walked over to the chest. She opened it, finding a stack of neatly folded woolen blankets. They smelled of cedar and something else, a faint, floral scent that reminded her of her mother's garden, a lifetime ago. The memory brought a sharp pang of longing, a reminder of the life she'd left behind. She turned her back to him, a self-conscious gesture, and began to undress. The wet clothes clung to her skin, making the task awkward and difficult. She could feel his gaze on her back, even though she couldn't see him. It was a strange sensation, unsettling yet not entirely unpleasant. She wrapped herself in one of the blankets, the soft wool a welcome comfort against her chilled skin. She turned back to face him, clutching the blanket tightly around her. He was standing by the fire, stirring a pot that hung over the flames. The aroma of stew filled the cabin, making her stomach rumble. "Hungry?" he asked, without looking at her. She nodded, suddenly realizing how ravenous she was. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. He ladled some stew into 2 tin bowls and handed one to her. He gestured towards the table.
"Seek."
She sat down at the table, her legs still trembling slightly. He sat across from her, his presence filling the small space. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clinking of spoons against tin and the crackling of the fire. The stew was simple, but hearty and flavorful, warming her from the inside out. As she ate, she studied him, trying to decipher the man behind the stoic mask. His face was etched with lines of hardship, his eyes shadowed with a weariness that seemed to go beyond mere fatigue. He was a man who had seen things, experienced things, that she could only imagine. And yet, there was a gentleness in his hands as he held his bowl, a quiet strength in his posture that hinted at a deeper complexity. "What brings you out this way?" he asked, breaking the silence. His voice was still rough, but there was a hint of curiosity in it. Florrie hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I'm traveling," she said vaguely. "Traveling where?" She shrugged. "Nowhere in particular." He raised an eyebrow, a silent challenge. "Everyone's going somewhere." She looked down at her bowl, avoiding his gaze. "I'm just looking for a place to belong." It was the truth, or at least a part of it. She was looking for a place where she could escape her past, a place where she could finally find peace. He didn't press her, for which she was grateful. He seemed to understand, on some level, the need for silence, the desire to keep secrets hidden. "Name's Ethan West," he said, after another long silence. "Florence Tate," she replied, offering her own name in return. "But most people call me Florrie." He nodded, a flicker of something that might have been a smile crossing his lips. "Florrie," he repeated, the name sounding strangely unfamiliar on his tongue. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, a fragile sense of peace had settled. Florrie found herself feeling strangely safe, despite the inherent danger of her situation. She was alone with a stranger, a man who could easily overpower her, a man who carried the weight of the frontier on his shoulders. And yet, she felt a connection to him, a shared understanding of the hardships of life, the loneliness of the road. She watched him carefully as he rose and went back to the fire to pour 2 tin mugs of surprisingly strong coffee. He held one out to her and, on instinct, she reached for it, her fingers just slightly grazing his. The briefest of touches, and yet, the feeling sent a shiver of something she hadn't felt in years. Something she thought she had lost forever, along with everything else. Chapter 3. Whispers of Lost Trails and Hidden Truths. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it warmed her from the inside out, chasing away the last vestiges of the chill. Florrie sat curled up in the armchair near the fire, wrapped in a blanket, watching Ethan as he moved around the cabin, tidying up with an efficiency born of long habit. He moved with a quiet grace, his movements economical and purposeful. He was a man who was comfortable in his own skin, comfortable in his solitude. How long have you lived here? Florrie asked, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. Ethan paused, his hand resting on the back of a chair. Long enough, he replied, his voice noncommittal. She waited, sensing he wasn't going to elaborate. She studied him, trying to piece together the puzzle of his life. The cabin, the books, the weapons, the scar, they all hinted at a story, a past that he kept carefully guarded. He glanced at her, his eyes catching the firelight. What about you, Florrie Tate? What's your story? She hesitated, the question catching her off guard. She wasn't used to people asking about her past. She'd become adept at deflecting such inquiries, at keeping her secrets hidden. But there was something in Ethan's gaze, a quiet intensity, that made her want to confide in him.
It's a long story, she said softly.
We've got time, he replied, his voice a low rumble. Storm's not letting up anytime soon. She took a deep breath, the scent of wood smoke and coffee filling her lungs. I ran away, she confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. He didn't seem surprised. He simply nodded, encouraging her to continue. For my family, from a life I didn't want. She paused, the memories flooding back, bittersweet and painful. I was supposed to marry a man I didn't love, a wealthy rancher, old enough to be my father.
It was expected of me.
A good match. She gave a bitter laugh. My family valued security and social standing above all else. Ethan remained silent, listening intently, his eyes fixed on her face. I couldn't do it, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. I couldn't live a life that wasn't my own. So I left. In the middle of the night. Took nothing but the clothes on my back and a few belongings. She looked down at her hands, twisting the blanket in her lap.
They disowned me.
Said I was dead to them. The words still stung, even after all these years. And you've been running ever since? Ethan asked softly. She nodded, trying to find a place where I could be myself, where I wouldn't be judged for the choices I made. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. Have you ever felt that way, Ethan? Like you were trapped in a life you didn't choose? His expression hardened, his eyes darkening with a shadow of pain. He said, his voice rough with emotion. I know that feeling well. He turned away, staring into the fire, his silence speaking volumes. Florrie sensed she had touched a nerve, a hidden wound that he kept carefully concealed. I lost someone, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Someone I loved. A long time ago. Florrie waited, her heart aching for him. She knew the pain of loss, the emptiness that it left behind. She was everything to me, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. We were going to be married, build a life together. He paused, his jaw clenching. But things happened, things I couldn't control. He didn't elaborate, and Florrie didn't press him. She understood the need for silence, the reluctance to revisit painful memories. It was my fault, he said, his voice filled with self-reproach. I should have protected her. Florrie reached out and touched his arm, a gesture of comfort and understanding. Sometimes bad things happen, she said softly. Things we can't prevent. It's not always our fault. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. The connection between them deepened, a shared understanding of loss and regret. They were two wounded souls, seeking solace in the midst of a storm, finding a fragile connection in their shared pain. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside the cabin, a quiet intimacy had settled between them. They were strangers, and yet they were not. They had shared their secrets, their vulnerabilities, forging a bond that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. Florrie felt a stirring of hope, a flicker of warmth in the cold, empty space within her. Perhaps, just perhaps, she had finally found a place where she could stop running. Perhaps she had found a place where she could finally begin to heal, helped in the process by a man whose own heart had been as wounded and as tested as her own. A long silence stretched out, and then she noticed him studying his hands, flexing his fingers. The motion was restless, uneasy. What else had he not said? Chapter 4. Echoes of gunfire and gentle words. The silence stretched, comfortable, yet charged with unspoken questions. Florrie watched Ethan, his gaze still fixed on the fire, his profile etched against the flickering light. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper now, the scar on his cheek more pronounced. She wondered about the circumstances that had led to that scar, the story it held. Suddenly, a sharp crack, like a gunshot, echoed from outside. Florrie jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. Ethan was instantly alert, his body tensing, his hand moving instinctively towards the rifle hanging above the door. "What was that?" Florrie whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan listened intently, his eyes scanning the windows. "Could be anything," he said, his voice low and cautious.
Tree branch snapping.
Rock slide. But his tone belied his words. He was on guard, ready for trouble. The storm had provided a convenient cover for all sorts of unsavory characters. Outlaws, rustlers, desperate men driven to desperate measures. Florrie knew the dangers of the frontier all too well. Another crack, closer this time. Definitely a gunshot. Ethan grabbed the rifle, his movements swift and decisive. He checked the load, his face grim. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice firm. "Don't open the door for anyone." Florrie nodded, her fear a tangible presence in the small cabin. She watched him as he moved towards the door, his body a coiled spring, ready to unleash. He was a different man now, the quiet, introspective man replaced by a hardened warrior. He eased the door open a crack, peering out into the darkness. The wind and rain lashed at his face, but he didn't flinch. He stood there for a long moment, his senses straining, his rifle at the ready. Florrie held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and something else. Excitement? Perhaps. She'd been running from danger for so long, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to face it head-on. Ethan slowly closed the door, his expression unreadable. "Can't see anything," he said, his voice still low. "But someone's out there." He moved to the windows, checking the shutters, making sure they were securely fastened. The cabin felt like a fortress now, a small island of safety in a sea of danger. He turned back to Florrie, his gaze softening slightly. "Don't worry," he said, his voice gentler now. "I won't let anything happen to you." His words were reassuring, but Florrie knew the reality of the situation. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and isolated. Their chances of survival were slim. "Who do you think it is?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan shrugged. "Could be anyone. This territory's crawling with outlaws. Could be the remnants of the Blackwood Gang. Heard they were operating in this area." The Blackwood Gang. The name sent a shiver down Florrie's spine. They were notorious for their ruthlessness, their brutality. She'd heard stories about them, whispered around campfires, tales of murder and mayhem. Ethan paced the cabin, his restless energy filling the small space. He was thinking, planning, strategizing. He was a man who was used to dealing with danger, a man who knew how to survive. He stopped in front of her, his eyes meeting hers. "I need you to be strong, Florrie," he said, his voice firm but kind.
"Can you do that?"
She nodded, her fear battling with a newfound determination. She wouldn't be a burden. She wouldn't let him down. He reached out and touched her cheek, his hand surprisingly gentle. "I know you've been through a lot," he said, his voice soft. "But you're not alone anymore." His touch sent a shiver through her, a warmth that spread through her body. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. It was a promise of protection, a sign of trust. He moved away, breaking the spell. He went back to the fireplace, adding more wood to the fire. The flames leaped higher, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "We'll wait them out," he said, his voice resolute. "They'll get tired eventually, or the storm will drive them away." Florrie nodded, her gaze fixed on him. She trusted him. She had no reason to, and every reason not to, but she did. She trusted him with her life. And in that moment, surrounded by danger, she realized something else. She was falling for him. This rugged, dangerous, emotionally scarred man was slowly, surely, stealing her heart. She wasn't sure if it was the shared danger, the shared vulnerability, or something deeper, something more profound. But it was happening. And she was terrified. And strangely, exhilaratingly, alive. Outside, the sporadic gunshots had stopped, but the silence that took its place was, in its own way, even more frightening. Chapter 5. The Weight of Secrets in a Barren Land. The silence that followed the gunshots was heavy, thick with anticipation. The storm continued to rage, a relentless backdrop to the tension that gripped the cabin. Florrie sat huddled in the armchair, her eyes darting between Ethan and the windows, her senses on high alert. Ethan remained by the fireplace, his rifle resting across his knees, his gaze fixed on the door. He was a picture of calm vigilance, a sentinel guarding their fragile sanctuary. Hours crawled by. The fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The only sounds were the crackling of the embers, the howling wind, and the rhythmic drumming of rain against the roof. Florrie's eyelids grew heavy, her exhaustion battling with her fear. She fought to stay awake, determined to be ready for whatever came next. Ethan stirred, rising from his position by the fireplace. He stretched, his muscles cracking, his movements still fluid and graceful despite the tension. He glanced at Florrie, his eyes softening slightly. "Try to get some sleep," he said, his voice low and gentle. "I'll keep watch." Florrie shook her head. "I couldn't," she replied, her voice hoarse. "Not with everything." He nodded, understanding. He knew the feeling. The inability to rest when danger lurked just outside the door. He moved to the table, picking up the half-finished carving of the hawk. He held it in his hands, his fingers tracing the lines of the bird's outstretched wings. "My father taught me to carve," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Said it was a way to connect with nature, to find peace in the midst of chaos." Florrie watched him, fascinated by the way his hands moved over the wood, so gentle, so precise. It was a stark contrast to the image of him holding the rifle, ready to kill. "He was a good man," Ethan continued, his voice filled with a quiet sadness. "A simple man. He loved the land. He loved my mother." He paused, his gaze drifting towards the window, as if looking out at something beyond the storm. "They were killed by raiders. Comancheros. They took everything. Burned our ranch to the ground." Florrie's heart ached for him. She knew the pain of losing loved ones, the emptiness that it left behind. She reached out and touched his arm, a gesture of comfort and understanding. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she said softly. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. "It was a long time ago," he said, his voice rough. "But some wounds, they never fully heal." He put the carving down, his hand lingering on the smooth wood. "I hunted them down," he said, his voice turning cold, his eyes hardening. "Every last one of them." Florrie shivered. She could see the darkness in him now, the capacity for violence that lurked beneath the surface. It was a part of him, a consequence of the life he'd lived. "It didn't bring them back," he said, his voice filled with a bitter regret. "It didn't ease the pain. It just left me empty." He turned away, staring into the fire, his silence speaking volumes. Florrie realized the depth of his pain, the burden of his past. He was a man haunted by loss, driven by revenge, consumed by guilt. "We all carry secrets, Ethan," she said softly. "Things we've done. Things we regret." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "What about you, Florrie? What secrets do you carry?" She hesitated, the question weighing heavily on her. She'd revealed some of her past, but not all of it. There were things she'd kept hidden, things she was ashamed of. I made mistakes," she said vaguely. "Choices I regret." "We all make mistakes," he replied, his voice gentle. "It's what we do afterwards that matters." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a warmth through her body. His fingers were calloused, rough from years of hard work, but his grip was gentle, reassuring. "You don't have to tell me," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "Not until you're ready." She nodded, grateful for his understanding. She felt a connection to him, a bond forged in shared pain and vulnerability. She was falling deeper, her heart entangled with his, despite the dangers, despite the uncertainties. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise of support. He released her hand and seemed about to say something more, but instead, he looked over his shoulder towards the window, his gaze fixing on one spot.
His entire posture changed.
He was no longer a man sharing a confidence. He was, once again, a wary, protective guardian. And that was when the silence was shattered, not by a gunshot, but by a pounding at the cabin door. Chapter 6. A shared meal and a shared silence. Ethan moved with lightning speed, grabbing his rifle and positioning himself near the door, his body shielding Flory. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice hard and commanding. The pounding continued, frantic and desperate. A voice, muffled by the storm and the thick wooden door, called out, "Help!
Please!
Let me in." It was a woman's voice, laced with fear and pain. Flory's instincts screamed at her to help, but Ethan remained unmoving, his eyes narrowed, his rifle trained on the door.
Who are you?
Ethan demanded, his voice unwavering. "My name is Sarah," the voice cried out.
"I'm Hurt.
"My horse threw me. Please, I need help." Ethan hesitated, his gaze flickering towards Flory. He was torn. He knew the dangers of the frontier, the tricks that outlaws use to lure their victims. But he also knew the desperation of being alone and injured in the wilderness. Flory met his gaze, her eyes pleading. "Ethan, we can't just leave her out there," she whispered.
He knew she was right.
He couldn't ignore a plea for help, even if it meant risking their own safety. He made a decision, his jaw set, his eyes still cautious. "Stay behind me," he ordered Flory, his voice low. He eased the door open a crack, his rifle ready. A woman stood huddled on the porch, her clothes soaked, her face pale and streaked with mud. She was young, no older than 20, her eyes wide with fear. She clutched her arm, her body trembling. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking.
"Help me."
Ethan studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching for any sign of deception. He saw nothing but genuine fear and pain. He slowly lowered his rifle, his body still tense. "Come in," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. The woman stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor near the hearth. Flory rushed to her side, helping her to sit up. "What happened?" Flory asked, her voice filled with concern. "My horse spooked," the woman gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts. "Threw me against a rock. I think my arm is broken." Flory gently examined the woman's arm, her touch careful and soothing. It was clearly broken, the bone protruding at an unnatural angle. Ethan stood over them, his rifle still in his hand, his eyes watchful. He didn't trust her completely, not yet. But he also knew she needed help. "I've got some bandages and splints," he said, his voice gruff. "I can set it." He moved to a wooden chest, retrieving a box filled with medical supplies. He knelt beside the woman, his movements surprisingly gentle. "This is going to hurt," he warned, his voice softer now. The woman nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you both." Ethan worked quickly and efficiently, setting the broken bone, splinting it securely. Flory helped, holding the woman's hand, offering words of comfort. The woman, Sarah, winced in pain, but she didn't cry out. She was tough, resilient, despite her fear. Once the arm was set, Ethan helped Sarah to the armchair near the fire. Flory wrapped her in a blanket, offering her a cup of water. "What were you doing out here all alone?" Ethan asked, his voice still cautious. Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting around the cabin. "I was traveling to Silver Creek," she said, her voice faltering. "To meet my brother." "Silver Creek's a long way from here," Ethan said, his eyes narrowed. "Dangerous territory." Sarah nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I know," she whispered. "But I had to get away." She didn't elaborate, and Ethan didn't press her. He sensed she was hiding something, but he also knew she was exhausted and in pain. He decided to wait until morning to question her further. The storm had begun to subside, the wind dying down, the rain softening to a drizzle. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the cabin. A strange sense of camaraderie had settled among the three of them, a shared sense of relief at having survived the night. Florrie made some more stew, and they ate together, sharing the meager meal in silence. The food was simple, but it tasted like a feast. It was a shared meal, a shared silence, a shared moment of peace in the midst of uncertainty. Sarah ate little, but Florrie could see the exhaustion beginning to claim her. The tension in the room, while present, lessened fractionally. However, when Sarah's eyes met Ethan's across the fire, Florrie saw something pass between them, something too quick to interpret, but present all the same. And for some reason, the sight made Florrie's heart clench with an emotion she couldn't quite, or didn't want to name. Chapter 7. Scars that speak louder than words. Sleep came eventually, fitful and uneasy for Florrie. She lay on a makeshift bed of blankets on the floor, her mind racing, her body exhausted but unable to fully relax. She listened to the sounds of the cabin, Ethan's steady breathing from the loft above, Sarah's occasional whimpers of pain from the armchair, the crackling of the dying embers in the fireplace. She thought about Ethan, about his quiet strength, his hidden pain, his unexpected gentleness. She thought about Sarah, about the secrets she seemed to be hiding, the fear that lingered in her eyes. And she thought about the look that had passed between them, the unspoken connection that had sent a shiver of unease through her. She drifted in and out of sleep, her dreams filled with images of storms and gunfire, of running and hiding, of Ethan's face, his eyes both dark and comforting. She woke with a start, her heart pounding, her body covered in a cold sweat. The cabin was quiet, the first rays of dawn filtering through the cracks in the shutters. Ethan was already up, standing by the window, looking out at the aftermath of the storm. He turned as she stirred, his eyes meeting hers. "Morning," he said, his voice low and rough. "Morning," she replied, her voice hoarse. He moved to the fireplace, adding more wood to the embers, coaxing the flames back to life. The warmth spread through the cabin, chasing away the morning chill. Sarah was still asleep in the armchair, her face pale and drawn, her arm wrapped in the splint. She looked vulnerable, fragile, a stark contrast to the image of the tough, resilient woman from the night before. Ethan prepared a simple breakfast of coffee and dried meat. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the chirping of birds outside. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and fresh. As they ate, Florrie studied Ethan, noticing the details she hadn't seen before. The way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was thinking, the way his hands, calloused and scarred, moved with such precision and care. She remembered the scar on his cheek, the one he'd never explained. She wondered about it again, about the story it held. It was a visible scar, a mark of a past trauma. But she knew there were other scars, invisible ones, that ran deeper, that shaped the man he was. "How did you get that scar?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Ethan's hand went instinctively to his cheek, his fingers tracing the jagged line. He hesitated, his eyes darkening with a shadow of pain. "It was a long time ago," he said, his voice evasive. Florrie waited, sensing he wasn't going to elaborate. She didn't want to pry, but she was curious, drawn to the mystery of his past. He sighed, his gaze drifting towards the window. "It happened during a fight," he said, his voice low. "A disagreement over land. With a neighbor." He stopped there, unwilling, or unable, to offer more. It was clearly a lie, or at least a partial truth. Florrie could see it in his eyes, in the way he avoided her gaze. There was more to the story, something he was deliberately withholding. "It must have been painful," she said softly. He nodded, his jaw clenching. "It was," he admitted. "But it taught me a lesson." "What lesson?" He looked at her, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of something that might have been regret crossing his face. "That violence, it never solves anything," he said, his voice filled with a bitter wisdom. "It just creates more pain. More scars." He turned away, staring into the fire, his silence speaking volumes. Florrie understood. She knew the truth of his words. She'd seen the consequences of violence, the damage it inflicted, both physical and emotional. She reached out and touched his arm, a gesture of comfort and understanding.
We all have scars, Ethan, she said softly.
Visible and invisible, they're a part of who we are. They remind us of what we've been through, what we've survived. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something deeper, something that made her heart flutter. It was a moment of connection, a shared understanding of pain and resilience. The scars they both carried, seen and unseen, had in some strange way brought them together. He covered her hand with his own. The contact was brief, but the unspoken words in that fleeting touch echoed in the silence far longer. The sound of Sarah stirring in the armchair broke the quiet intimacy. Chapter 8. The uneasy truce of trust and fear. Sarah woke with a groan, her face contorted in pain. She shifted in the armchair, her eyes fluttering open. She looked around the cabin, her gaze disoriented, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. Where am I?" she mumbled, her voice weak. Florrie moved to her side, offering her a reassuring smile. "You're safe," she said softly. "You're in Ethan's cabin. You were injured. Your horse threw you." Sarah's eyes widened, her memory returning. She touched her arm, wincing at the pain. "Oh," she whispered.
"Right."
Ethan came over, handing her a cup of water. "Drink this," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Sarah took the cup, her hand trembling. She took a few sips, her eyes meeting Ethan's. There was that look again, that fleeting connection that Florrie had noticed the night before. It was gone in an instant, but it left Florrie feeling uneasy. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. "Both of you. For helping me." "You're welcome," Florrie replied. Ethan remained silent, his eyes watchful, his expression unreadable. He still didn't fully trust her, not yet. They ate a simple breakfast, the three of them sitting around the table, the atmosphere strained with unspoken questions. Sarah ate little, her appetite diminished by pain and exhaustion. She kept glancing at Ethan, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something that Florrie couldn't quite decipher. "So," Ethan said, breaking the silence, "you said you were traveling to Silver Creek. To meet your brother." Sarah nodded, her gaze dropping to the table. "Yes," she replied, her voice faltering. "What's your brother's name?" Ethan asked, his voice probing. Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting around the cabin. "His name is John," she said, her voice unconvincing. "John Smith." It was a common name, too common. Florrie could see the doubt in Ethan's eyes. He didn't believe her. "And what does your brother do in Silver Creek?" Ethan continued, his voice persistent. Sarah shrugged, her shoulders slumping. He works in the saloon," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He's a bartender." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Sarah. "You're lying," he said, his voice flat. Sarah's eyes widened, her face paling. "No," she stammered. I'm not." "You're not going to Silver Creek," Ethan said, his voice rising slightly. "And your brother's not a bartender named John Smith."
"Who are you?
"And what are you running from?" Sarah's body trembled, her eyes filling with tears. She looked from Ethan to Florrie, her expression desperate.
"Please," she begged.
"You have to believe me. I'm in danger." "We all are, out here," Ethan retorted. That storm provided perfect cover. "Now that it's past, if you have enemies, they'll be looking." "It's not like that," Sarah began, then stopped. She took a ragged breath. I can't tell you." "Can't or won't." Ethan pressed. Florrie intervened, placing a hand on Ethan's arm. "Ethan, she's scared," she said softly.
"Give her some time."
Ethan looked at Florrie, his eyes softening slightly. He knew she was right. He was pushing her too hard. But he also knew she was hiding something important. He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "All right," he said, his voice relenting. "We'll give you some time. But you need to tell us the truth. Eventually." We can't help you if we don't know what's going on. Sarah nodded, her tears flowing freely. Thank you, she whispered. I will. I promise. An uneasy truce settled over the cabin. Trust was fragile, suspicion lingered. Florrie felt caught in the middle, torn between her desire to help Sarah and her loyalty to Ethan. She knew the dangers of the frontier, the risks of trusting strangers. But she also saw the genuine fear in Sarah's eyes, the desperation in her plea. The day passed slowly. Ethan spent most of his time outside, tending to Bess and his own horse, a sturdy black stallion named Midnight. Florrie stayed inside, helping Sarah, changing her bandages, offering her food and water. She tried to draw Sarah out, to get her to talk, but Sarah remained guarded, her secrets locked tightly within. Florrie watched them both, Ethan, as he returned to the cabin, Sarah as she nervously twisted a lock of her hair. Both were clearly hiding things, both were wary. And Florrie, caught in the middle, felt the familiar, heavy weight of other people's secrets pressing down on her, threatening to suffocate her with a burden that was not hers to carry. The air grew thick, not with the humidity of the departed storm, but with something far more dangerous. Chapter 9. Shadows of Doubt in the Flickering Light. As evening approached, the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly tense. The flickering lamplight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, mirroring the shadows of doubt that clouded Florrie's mind. Sarah remained withdrawn, her eyes darting nervously around the room, her body tense and watchful. Ethan was quiet and brooding, his gaze fixed on the fire, his thoughts hidden behind a mask of stoicism. Florrie tried to ease the tension, making small talk, offering tea, but her efforts felt futile. The unspoken questions hung heavy in the air, a barrier between them. She knew they couldn't continue like this, living in a state of uneasy truce. The truth, whatever it was, needed to come out. After they had eaten a silent supper, Ethan rose from the table, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. He looked at Sarah, his eyes hard and unwavering. It's time, he said, his voice firm. No more secrets. No more lies. Tell us what's going on. Sarah flinched, her body trembling. She looked from Ethan to Florrie, her expression desperate. I can't, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. You have to, Ethan insisted. We need to know who you are. Who's after you? Why you're here? Sarah shook her head, her tears flowing freely. They'll kill me, she sobbed. They'll kill you both. Who will? Ethan demanded. Tell us. Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting towards the window, as if expecting someone to appear. She took a deep breath, her body shaking. My husband, she finally confessed, her voice barely a whisper. He's a dangerous man. Florrie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She hadn't expected that. She'd assumed Sarah was running from outlaws, from some kind of criminal entanglement. But a husband, that was a different kind of danger. What kind of dangerous? Ethan asked, his voice low and cautious. Sarah's eyes were wide with fear, her voice trembling. He's the leader of the Blackwood gang, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. Ethan's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. The Blackwood gang. The name echoed in the silence, a chilling reminder of the ruthlessness and brutality that lurked in the shadows of the frontier. Florrie felt a surge of fear, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. She'd heard the stories, the whispers of their cruelty. She'd hoped they were just legends, exaggerated tales to frighten travelers. But now, here was Sarah, confirming their existence, their power. Why are you running from him? Florrie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of shame and defiance. Because I betrayed him, she said, her voice trembling. I helped someone escape. Someone he wanted dead. Who? Ethan asked, his voice sharp. Sarah hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. A man, she said vaguely. A prisoner. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. What man? What prisoner? Sarah shook her head, her tears flowing faster. I can't tell you, she sobbed. He'll find out. He'll kill him. He'll kill me. We can protect you, Ethan said, his voice firm. But you need to trust us. You need to tell us everything. Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his. She seemed to be struggling with a decision, torn between her fear and her need for help. His name was Samuel, she finally whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He was a good man. He didn't deserve to die. Ethan and Florrie exchanged a look. The name didn't mean anything to them, but it clearly meant something to Sarah. And your husband, what's his name? Ethan asked, his voice gentle. Sarah hesitated, her body trembling. She looked at Ethan, her eyes pleading.
Please, she begged. Don't make me say it.
Ethan sighed, his shoulders slumping. He knew he couldn't force her. He had to earn her trust. All right, he said, his voice relenting. We won't press you. But you need to understand we're in danger now. Because of you. Because of your husband. Sarah nodded, her tears streaming down her face. I know, she whispered.
I'm sorry.
The shadows deepened in the cabin, the flickering lamplight casting an eerie glow on their faces. Florrie felt a sense of foreboding, a premonition of danger. They were caught in a web of secrets and lies, trapped in a deadly game they didn't understand. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the worst was yet to come. Outside, a wolf howled. It was a lonely, mournful sound, and it made the hair on the back of Florrie's neck stand on end. Chapter 10. The Unveiling of a Shattered Mirror. The night stretched on, punctuated by Sarah's quiet sobs and the unsettling silence from Ethan. Florrie couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. The revelation about Sarah's husband, the leader of the notorious Blackwood gang, had cast a long, dark shadow over their fragile sanctuary. Florrie found herself staring into the dying embers of the fire, her mind replaying Sarah's words, her tear-streaked face, the palpable fear that radiated from her. She tried to piece together the fragmented story, to understand the motivations, the connections, the hidden truths. She glanced at Ethan, who sat across the room, his rifle resting across his knees, his gaze fixed on the window. He was a fortress, a silent guardian, but even he seemed vulnerable tonight, his usual stoicism replaced by a grim determination. She thought about her own past, the secrets she carried, the reasons she'd run. Compared to Sarah's predicament, her own troubles seemed almost trivial. Yet, they were all running from something, seeking refuge, searching for peace. She decided to speak, to break the heavy silence that had fallen between them. Ethan, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. He turned, his eyes meeting hers. There was a question in his gaze, a weariness that mirrored her own. Do you believe her? She asked, her voice hesitant. He sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. I don't know, he admitted.
Part of me wants to.
Part of me doesn't trust anyone. Florrie nodded, understanding his struggle. Trust was a precious commodity in this harsh land, easily broken, hard to earn. She's terrified, Florrie said, her voice filled with empathy. That much is real. Ethan nodded, his gaze softening slightly. He agreed. She's running from something.
Someone.
And that makes her dangerous. But we can't just abandon her, Florrie said, her voice pleading. We can't send her back to that. Ethan looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the compassion in her gaze, the unwavering belief in the good in people. It was a quality he admired, a quality he'd lost somewhere along the way. I know, he said, his voice gruff. We won't. He rose from his chair, moving towards Sarah, who was huddled in the armchair, her body trembling. He knelt beside her, his presence surprisingly gentle. Sarah, he said softly, his voice kind. We're going to help you. But you need to help us. You need to tell us everything. We need to know who this Samuel was. Why your husband wanted him dead. The more we know, the better we can protect ourselves. Protect you. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, her expression a mixture of fear and hope. She hesitated, her body shaking. He was a Pinkerton, she finally confessed, her voice barely a whisper. An agent. Investigating my husband. A Pinkerton. The word hung in the air, a revelation that changed everything. Pinkerton agents were known for their relentless pursuit of justice, their unwavering dedication to the law. They were a force to be reckoned with, even for a man as powerful as the leader of the Blackwood gang. "Why was he investigating your husband?" Florrie asked, her voice curious. Sarah's gaze dropped to the floor, her voice filled with shame. Because of me," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I gave him information about my husband's activities." Florrie gasped, her eyes widening. Sarah was an informant. She'd betrayed her husband, risked her life, to help bring him to justice. It was a courageous act, a desperate attempt to escape a life of violence and fear. I couldn't stand it anymore," Sarah continued, her tears flowing freely. "The killing, the stealing, the cruelty. I wanted out. I wanted a different life." She looked at Ethan, her eyes pleading. "Samuel, he promised to help me. He promised to protect me. But my husband found out. He killed him." Her voice broke, her body racked with sobs. The image of Samuel, the Pinkerton agent, dying at the hands of the Blackwood gang, filled Florrie's mind. It was a brutal reminder of the stakes, the consequences of their actions. Ethan placed a hand on Sarah's arm, his touch surprisingly gentle. "We'll protect you, Sarah," he said, his voice firm. "We won't let him hurt you." His words were a promise, a vow. Florrie knew he meant it. He would defend her, even if it meant risking his own life. She felt a surge of admiration for him, a deepening of the connection that had been growing between them. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you both." The truth was out, the shattered mirror pieced back together, revealing a picture far more complex and dangerous than they could have imagined. They were no longer just sheltering a woman from a storm. They were protecting an informant, a traitor, a woman who had dared to defy the leader of the Blackwood gang. And they knew, with a chilling certainty, that retribution was coming. It was only a matter of time. Outside, the wind picked up again. It was a low, moaning sound, like a grieving spirit, foretelling trouble. Chapter 11. Bonds forged in the crucible of survival. The revelation of Sarah's past and her connection to the murdered Pinkerton agent, Samuel, changed the dynamic in the cabin. The air of suspicion that had surrounded Sarah dissipated, replaced by a shared sense of purpose and a grim determination to protect her. They were an unlikely trio, bound together by circumstance and a common enemy. Ethan, ever the pragmatist, began to make preparations. He checked his weapons, cleaning and oiling his rifle and revolver, his movements precise and efficient. He reinforced the shutters on the windows, adding extra bars of wood, turning the cabin into a makeshift fortress. He was preparing for a siege, a showdown with the Blackwood gang. Florrie, despite her lack of experience with violence, found herself drawn into the preparations. She helped Ethan, fetching supplies, holding tools, offering support. She discovered a strength within herself she hadn't known she possessed, a resilience born of necessity. Sarah, still weak and recovering from her broken arm, watched them, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. She felt responsible for the danger they were in, for the disruption she had brought into their lives. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I shouldn't have come here. I've put you both in danger." Florrie placed a comforting hand on Sarah's arm. "Don't say that," she said softly. "We're glad you're here. We're going to help you." Ethan, overhearing their conversation, turned to Sarah, his expression softening slightly. "She's right," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "We're not going to let anything happen to you." His words were reassuring, but Sarah knew the reality of the situation. Her husband was ruthless, relentless. He wouldn't stop until he found her, until he exacted his revenge. As the day wore on, they worked together, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Ethan showed Florrie how to load and fire a rifle, his instructions patient and clear. She practiced, her hands trembling at first, but gradually gaining confidence. She knew she might have to use it, to defend herself, to defend them. They shared stories, their pasts weaving together, creating a tapestry of shared experiences. Florrie told them about her life before she ran, about her family, about the expectations she'd rejected. Ethan spoke of his ranch, of his parents, of the loss that had shaped him. Sarah, hesitantly at first, revealed more details about her life with her husband, about the violence she'd witnessed, the fear she'd endured. The sharing created a bond between them, a sense of camaraderie forged in the crucible of survival. They were no longer strangers, but allies, friends, a makeshift family united against a common enemy. As evening approached, a sense of anticipation settled over the cabin. The air was thick with tension, the silence punctuated by the creaking of the wood, the rustling of the wind, the distant howl of a coyote. They ate a simple meal, sharing the last of their supplies. They spoke little, their thoughts focused on the impending danger. They knew the Blackwood gang could arrive at any moment, their numbers unknown, their intentions deadly. Ethan took the first watch, his rifle resting across his knees, his eyes scanning the darkness. Florrie and Sarah huddled together near the fire, their bodies close, their fears shared. Florrie looked at Ethan, her heart filled with a mixture of admiration and fear. She admired his strength, his courage, his unwavering determination to protect them. But she also feared for him, for his safety, for the risks he was taking. She realized, with a startling clarity, that she had fallen deeply in love with him. It was a love born of adversity, of shared danger, of mutual respect. It was a love that transcended the circumstances, a love that defied the odds. She knew it was a dangerous love, a love with no guarantees, a love that could be snatched away at any moment. But she couldn't deny it, couldn't suppress it. It was a part of her now, woven into the fabric of her being. She closed her eyes, her thoughts filled with Ethan, her heart aching with a mixture of hope and fear. She prayed for their survival, for their future, for a chance to live, to love, to be free. The hours ticked by slowly, each one an eternity. Florrie dozed fitfully, her sleep disturbed by nightmares. Then, sometime before dawn, she heard it. The unmistakable sound of horses' hooves, approaching fast. She bolted upright and, simultaneously, Ethan was on his feet. The time had come. Chapter 12. The Price of Freedom and the Cost of Love. Ethan moved swiftly and silently, extinguishing the lamp, plunging the cabin into near darkness. The only light came from the dying embers of the fire, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "They're here," he whispered, his voice tense but calm. He handed Florrie a rifle, his eyes meeting hers. "Stay behind me. Don't shoot unless you have to." Florrie nodded, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands gripping the rifle tightly. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and determination. She was ready. Sarah huddled in the corner, her body trembling, her eyes wide with terror. Florrie placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's going to be all right," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed her own words. The sound of horses' hooves grew louder, closer. They surrounded the cabin, their riders dismounting, their voices muffled but menacing. Ethan positioned himself near the door, his rifle raised, his body a shield. A voice, harsh and cruel, shattered the silence. "Sarah, come out. We know you're in there." It was her husband's voice, the voice she dreaded, the voice that haunted her nightmares. Florrie felt Sarah's body stiffen with fear. Ethan remained silent, his eyes fixed on the door, his finger on the trigger. He wouldn't negotiate. He wouldn't surrender. He would fight. "I'm giving you one chance, Sarah." The voice shouted again. "Come out now, and I'll make it quick. Stay in there, and it'll be slow and painful. For all of you." The threat hung in the air, heavy and chilling. Florrie felt a surge of anger, a fierce protectiveness towards Sarah, towards Ethan. She wouldn't let this man, this monster, hurt them. "We're not coming out." Ethan shouted back, his voice defiant. "You want her, you'll have to come through me." A volley of gunfire erupted, bullets ripping through the wooden walls of the cabin, splintering wood, shattering glass. Florrie ducked, covering Sarah with her body, shielding her from the onslaught. Ethan returned fire, his shots precise and deadly. He was a skilled marksman, his years of experience on the frontier evident in his every move. The battle raged, a chaotic symphony of gunfire and shouts, of splintering wood and shattering glass. The cabin shook under the assault, the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and smoke. Florrie, despite her fear, found herself caught up in the fight. She saw a figure moving outside the window, his rifle raised. She aimed and fired, her shot hitting its mark. The figure stumbled, falling to the ground. She felt a surge of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't triumph, exactly. It was more like survival. She had defended herself. She had protected them. The gunfire continued, relentless and unforgiving. Ethan moved from window to window, firing at the attackers, his movements fluid and graceful, his aim deadly. Florrie saw another figure, rushing towards the door, his hand reaching for the latch. She raised her rifle, her finger on the trigger, but hesitated. It was a young man, barely more than a boy, his face filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. She couldn't do it. She couldn't take a life, not like this. She lowered her rifle, her hands trembling. Ethan saw her hesitation. He shouted, his voice urgent, "Florrie, shoot." But it was too late. The young man burst through the door, his rifle raised. Ethan fired, his shot hitting the man in the chest, sending him sprawling backwards. The young man lay on the floor, his eyes wide with shock, his body convulsing. He was dying. Florrie felt a wave of nausea, a surge of horror. She had hesitated, and it had almost cost Ethan his life. She had almost failed. The gunfire outside had diminished. There was a long moment of silence, and Ethan, sensing a possible trick, stayed alert. Ethan looked at the body on the cabin floor, his expression grim, then he turned towards Florrie. His gaze moved from the rifle in her hands up to meet her eyes. What she saw there made her knees weak. Chapter 13. Broken Oaths and Unspoken Desires. The silence that followed the young man's death was heavy, broken only by Sarah's quiet sobs and the ragged breathing of the three survivors. The flickering light from the dying fire cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the scene even more surreal. Ethan's gaze, locked on Florrie's, was intense, filled with a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite decipher. Relief, certainly, that they were still alive. Anger, perhaps, at her hesitation. But there was something else, something deeper, something that made her heart flutter. He moved towards her, his steps slow and deliberate. He reached out and gently took the rifle from her trembling hands, placing it on the table. He then took her hands in his touch surprisingly gentle, his fingers calloused but warm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and rough, his eyes searching hers. Florrie nodded, unable to speak, her throat choked with emotion. She was shaken, traumatized by the violence, by the near-death experience. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. She buried her face in his chest, her body trembling, her tears soaking his shirt. He held her, his embrace strong and comforting, a haven in the midst of the chaos. "It's all right," he whispered, his voice soothing. "You're safe. It's over." But it wasn't over.
Not yet.
The Blackwood gang was still out there, their leader, Sarah's husband, still seeking revenge. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. After a long moment, Ethan released her, his hands lingering on her arms. He looked at her, his eyes filled with concern. "You hesitated," he said, his voice not accusatory but questioning.
"Why?"
Florrie looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. He was just a boy," she stammered. I couldn't kill him." Ethan sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. He understood. He'd seen the same hesitation in his own heart many years ago. He'd learned the hard way that hesitation could be deadly, that in this harsh land, survival often meant making impossible choices. "I know," he said softly, "but you have to be ready. Next time you might not have a choice." Florrie nodded, her tears flowing freely. She knew he was right. She had to be stronger, tougher, if she wanted to survive. He reached out and wiped away her tears with his thumb, his touch gentle and tender. "You did good, Flory," he said, his voice filled with a quiet admiration. "You fought. You protected Sarah. You saved my life." His words warmed her heart, easing the guilt and shame she felt. She had done her best, and it had been enough. He looked at Sarah, who was still huddled in the corner, her body trembling, her eyes wide with fear. "It's all right, Sarah," he said, his voice reassuring.
"They're gone. For now."
Sarah looked at him, her expression a mixture of relief and terror. "He'll be back," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "He won't give up." Ethan nodded, his jaw clenching.
"I know," he said.
"But we'll be ready." He turned back to Flory, his eyes meeting hers. The intensity of his gaze made her heart skip a beat. There was something unspoken between them, a connection that had deepened through the shared danger, the shared vulnerability. He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. She could feel his breath on her skin, smell the scent of wood smoke and gunpowder that clung to him. "Flory," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. She looked at him, her eyes questioning, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what was coming, what she had been longing for, what she had feared. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. His eyes, dark and intense, held a mixture of desire and tenderness. He said nothing. He simply stared, and Flory knew, without any words passing between them, what would follow. The promises made to others, the oaths sworn, all faded into the blurry distance. Chapter 14. The Dance of Deception and Revelation. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative touch, a question asked without words. Flory closed her eyes, her body trembling, her heart overflowing with a mixture of fear and desire. She had waited for this moment, dreamed of it, even though she knew it was forbidden, dangerous, reckless. His lips pressed against hers, a soft, gentle kiss, a promise of something deeper, something more profound. She responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer, her body melting into his. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent, a release of all the pent-up emotions, the fear, the tension, the longing. It was a kiss that spoke of shared danger, of mutual respect, of a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. It was a kiss that defied the odds, that challenged the darkness, that promised a future they might never have. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked, their hearts pounding in unison. The world outside the cabin, the danger that lurked in the shadows, seemed to fade away, replaced by the intensity of their connection, the undeniable truth of their feelings. "Ethan," Flory whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes searching his. He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up his face, erasing the lines of hardship and pain. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his touch gentle and tender. He began, his voice hesitant, his eyes filled with a mixture of desire and uncertainty. But before he could finish, a sound from outside interrupted them. A twig snapping, a muffled curse, a hoarse whinnying. Ethan's body stiffened, his senses instantly alert. He grabbed his rifle, his expression hardening, his eyes scanning the windows. "They're back," he said, his voice low and tense. The moment of intimacy, of shared passion, was shattered, replaced by the harsh reality of their situation. The Blackwood gang had returned, their leader seeking revenge, their numbers unknown. Flory's heart sank. She had hoped, foolishly, that they were safe, that the danger had passed. But she knew better. This was the frontier, a land of violence and betrayal, where love and hope were fragile commodities, easily crushed. Ethan moved towards the door, his rifle raised, his body a shield. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice firm. Flory nodded, her fear battling with a newfound determination. She wouldn't be a victim. She wouldn't cower in fear. She would fight. As Ethan reached for the door, Sarah cried out, her voice filled with terror.
"Wait!"
she screamed. "It's not them. It's someone else." Ethan hesitated, his hand on the latch, his eyes questioning. "Who?" he demanded. Sarah struggled to her feet, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else. "Recognition? Hope? It's a friend," she stammered. Someone who can help us." Ethan and Florrie exchanged a look. Who could possibly help them now? Who would be foolish enough to intervene in a fight with the Blackwood gang? Before Ethan could respond, the door burst open, and a figure stepped inside. It was a man, tall and imposing, his face hidden by the shadows of his hat, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "Hold your fire, West," the man said, his voice deep and resonant, a voice that sent a shiver down Florrie's spine. "I'm not here to fight you." Ethan kept his rifle trained on the newcomer, his eyes narrowed, his body tense. "Who are you?" he demanded. "And how do you know my name?" The man stepped forward, into the flickering light of the fire. His face was revealed, and Florrie gasped. It was a face she recognized, a face she had seen before, in a fleeting glimpse, in a whispered conversation. "My name is irrelevant," the man said, his voice smooth and confident. "But you can call me an associate of Samuel's." Sarah gasped, her eyes widening. "You know Samuel?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The man nodded, his gaze shifting to Sarah. "I do," he said. "And I know who killed him." He paused, then added, "I also know who really sent him to investigate the Blackwood gang." His eyes then fixed, with pointed intensity, on Florrie. Chapter 15. A glimmer of hope in the endless night. The man's words hung in the air, heavy and shocking, casting a new and unsettling light on the already complex situation. Florrie felt a cold dread creep into her heart, her mind reeling from the implication. She looked at Ethan, seeking reassurance, but his expression was unreadable, his eyes narrowed, his rifle still trained on the newcomer. "What are you talking about?" Ethan demanded, his voice hard and suspicious. The man, still unnamed, ignored Ethan, his gaze fixed on Florrie. "You know exactly what I'm talking about, Mrs. Tate," he said, emphasizing her title, a title she had abandoned, a title that belonged to a life she had desperately tried to leave behind. The blood drained from Florrie's face. She felt exposed, vulnerable, her carefully constructed facade shattered. How did this man know her name? Her past? Her connection to Samuel? Sarah looked from Florrie to the man, her expression confused and fearful. "Well, what's going on?" she whispered. "It seems our dear Florrie hasn't been entirely honest with us," the man said, his voice laced with a hint of mockery. "She's not just a runaway bride, seeking freedom from an unwanted marriage. She's something more." Ethan lowered his rifle slightly, his eyes flickering between Florrie and the man, his mind struggling to process the unfolding revelation. "Florrie?" he questioned, his voice a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Florrie couldn't meet his gaze. She felt ashamed, exposed, her secrets laid bare for all to see. She had deceived him, betrayed his trust, and now the consequences were coming back to haunt her. "Tell him, Florrie," the man said, his voice insistent. "Tell him who you really are. Tell him who hired Samuel." Florrie took a deep breath, her body trembling. She knew she couldn't hide any longer. The truth, however painful, had to come out. My family," she began, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes filled with tears. They own a mining company. A very successful mining company." Ethan's eyes widened, his expression shifting from confusion to shock. He knew the Tate Mining Company. It was one of the largest, most powerful companies in the territory, notorious for its ruthless business practices, its exploitation of workers, its disregard for the law. "And?" Ethan prompted, his voice tight. "And they suspected Sarah's husband, the leader of the Blackwood gang, of stealing their gold shipments," Florrie continued, her voice choked with emotion. "They couldn't prove it. The local law enforcement was in his pocket. So they hired a Pinkerton," Ethan finished, his voice filled with a bitter understanding. "Samuel." Florrie nodded, her tears flowing freely. "My brother, he hired Samuel. To investigate. To gather evidence. To bring the Blackwood gang to justice. And you knew about this? Ethan asked, his voice accusing. Florrie hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. I overheard them talking, she admitted. I knew Samuel was in danger. I tried to warn him. By running away? Ethan asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. I had to get away, Florrie pleaded. From my family. From their corruption. I couldn't be a part of it anymore. But you didn't tell me, Ethan said, his voice filled with a quiet hurt. You let me believe you were just a drifter. Florrie looked at him, her eyes filled with remorse. I was afraid, she confessed. Afraid of what you would think. Afraid of losing you. The man, the associate of Samuel, watched them, his expression a mixture of amusement and impatience. Touching, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But we have more pressing matters to discuss. He turned to Sarah, his gaze softening slightly. Sarah, I'm here to help you, he said. Samuel was a friend of mine. I want justice for his death. And I want to bring your husband to justice. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a flicker of hope. Can you protect me? She whispered. The man nodded. I can, he said. But we need to leave.
Now.
Before the Blackwood gang returns. Ethan stepped forward, his rifle still in his hand, but no longer aimed at the man.
Who are you?
He demanded. And how can we trust you? The man smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a shiver down Florrie's spine. My name is Agent Davies, he said. And you can trust me because we have a common enemy. And because I have something your Florrie wants. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. He held it up, the firelight glinting off its worn cover. Florrie recognized it instantly. It was Samuel's journal, the journal that contained all the evidence against the Blackwood gang, the journal that Sarah's husband would kill to possess. Davies held it almost casually, but Florrie knew it was the key, not just to the gang's destruction, but also to her own redemption. Chapter 16. The Reckoning of Hearts and Histories. Agent Davies' revelation about Samuel's journal and Florrie's true identity had shifted the power dynamics within the cabin. The immediate threat of the Blackwood gang seemed to recede, replaced by a more complex and nuanced danger. Trust, already fragile, was further fractured, replaced by suspicion and uncertainty. Ethan, still reeling from Florrie's deception, struggled to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the woman standing before him, a woman entangled in a web of family secrets and dangerous alliances. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt, anger, and something else. Something that still flickered with the embers of the love he had felt for her. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice low and rough, the question echoing the unspoken pain in his heart. Florrie looked at him, her eyes filled with remorse, her voice trembling. I was afraid, she confessed. Afraid of what you would think. Afraid of losing you. You lied to me, Ethan said, his voice flat, the words a stark accusation. I omitted things, Florrie corrected, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't want my past to define me. To define us. Ethan sighed, his shoulders slumping. He understood her fear, her desire to escape her past. He had his own secrets, his own demons he battled. But her deception cut deep, a betrayal of the trust he had placed in her. Agent Davies, observing their exchange, interjected, his voice impatient.
We don't have time for this, he said.
The Blackwood gang could return at any moment. We need to leave.
Now.
He turned to Sarah, his expression softening slightly. Sarah, are you ready to go? He asked. Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She had made her choice, betrayed her husband, and now she was ready to face the consequences. She trusted Agent Davies, Samuel's friend, to protect her. Ethan looked from Sarah to Davies, his mind racing. He didn't trust Davies completely, but he also knew they couldn't stay in the cabin. They were sitting ducks, vulnerable to another attack. Where are we going? Ethan asked, his voice cautious. Somewhere safe, Davies replied, his voice vague. Somewhere we can plan our next move. Somewhere we can bring the Blackwood gang to justice. He held up Samuel's journal, the leather-bound book glinting in the firelight. "This is our weapon," he said. "This contains all the evidence we need. Names, dates, locations. Everything." Florrie's gaze was fixed on the journal, her heart pounding in her chest. It was the key to her redemption, the chance to atone for her family's sins, to bring closure to Samuel's death, to finally break free from the shackles of her past. "We need to get that journal to the authorities," Florrie said, her voice firm, her determination renewed. Davies nodded. "That's the plan," he said. "But it won't be easy. The Blackwood gang has informants everywhere. We need to be careful. We need to trust no one." Ethan looked at Florrie, his eyes searching hers. He saw the determination in her gaze, the fire that had been rekindled. He saw the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman who had fought beside him, the woman who had saved his life. He made a decision. He would trust her. He would give her a chance to redeem herself, to prove her loyalty. He would stand by her, fight with her, protect her. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "Let's go." They gathered their belongings, their movements swift and efficient. Ethan checked his weapons, his rifle and revolver, his face grim. Florrie retrieved her own rifle, the weapon she had hesitated to use, the weapon that now represented her commitment to fight, to survive. They stepped out of the cabin, into the cold night air, the vast expanse of the frontier stretching before them, a landscape of both beauty and danger. They were an unlikely quartet, bound together by circumstance, by secrets, by a shared enemy. As they rode away from the cabin, Florrie looked back, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. The cabin, their temporary sanctuary, was now behind them, a symbol of the past they were leaving behind. She looked at Ethan, riding beside her, his face set, his eyes focused on the horizon. She knew their journey was far from over, that the dangers ahead were immense. But she also knew that she was not alone. She had Ethan, she had Sarah, she had Agent Davies, and she had the journal, the weapon that could bring down the Blackwood gang and finally set her free. She glanced at Davies and wondered whether his offer to take them somewhere safe was an offer or a threat. The reckoning, she knew, would involve more than just Sarah's husband. It would involve reckoning with herself. Chapter 17. The bittersweet taste of second chances. The journey was arduous and tense, the four riders traveling under the cover of darkness, avoiding main roads and settlements, sticking to the rough, unforgiving terrain. They spoke little, their thoughts focused on the dangers that lurked around every bend, the constant threat of the Blackwood gang, the uncertainty of their destination. Agent Davies led the way, his knowledge of the territory evident in his choice of routes, his ability to find hidden trails and secluded campsites. He was a man of few words, his actions efficient and purposeful, his demeanor guarded and secretive. He revealed little about himself, his past, his motivations, beyond his connection to Samuel and his desire for justice. Ethan rode beside Florrie, his presence a silent reassurance, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from his rifle. He was watchful, protective, his love for Florrie a silent undercurrent beneath the tension and uncertainty. Sarah rode behind them, her injured arm causing her constant pain, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She was the most vulnerable of the group, the target of the Blackwood gang's wrath, but she also possessed a quiet strength, a resilience born of surviving years of abuse and betrayal. Florrie, caught between Ethan and Davies, felt the weight of her past pressing down on her. She knew she had betrayed Ethan's trust, that her deception had put them all in danger. She longed to explain herself, to tell him everything, but the time never seemed right, the words always caught in her throat. During a brief rest stop, near a small, hidden spring, Florrie finally found the courage to speak. She approached Ethan, who was standing guard, his rifle resting across his knees, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice trembling. He turned, his eyes meeting hers. There was a guardedness in his expression, a wall he had erected between them, a protection against further hurt. I need to explain," she began, her voice hesitant. About everything." Ethan sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly.
I know, he said. Davies told me some of it.
About your family. About the mining company. It's complicated, Florrie said, her voice pleading. My family, they're not good people. They're ruthless, greedy. They'll do anything for power, for money.
And you?
Ethan asked, his voice probing. Are you like them? Florrie shook her head, her eyes filling with tears.
No, she said vehemently.
I'm not. I hate what they do. I hate what they stand for. That's why I ran. That's why I tried to help Samuel. Ethan looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the sincerity in her gaze, the pain in her voice. He wanted to believe her, to forgive her, to take her back into his heart. I want to believe you, Florrie, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But trust is a hard thing to rebuild. Florrie nodded, her tears flowing freely.
She knew he was right.
She had broken his trust, and it would take time and action to earn it back.
I know, she said softly.
And I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm not like them, that I love you. The words hung in the air, a confession, a plea, a promise. Ethan looked at her, his eyes softening slightly, the wall around his heart beginning to crumble. He reached out and touched her cheek, his hand gentle and tender. I love you too, Florrie, he said, his voice a whisper. But he didn't finish the sentence. The unspoken words hung between them, a reminder of the challenges they faced, the dangers that surrounded them, the uncertainty of their future. They were interrupted by Davies, who approached them, his expression urgent.
We need to move, he said.
We're too exposed here. They mounted their horses, continuing their journey, the bittersweet taste of second chances mingling with the bitter reality of their situation. They were riding towards an unknown destination, towards a confrontation with the Blackwood gang, towards a reckoning with their pasts. The love between Ethan and Florrie was fragile, wounded, but it was still alive, a flicker of hope in the endless night. They had a long way to go and, looking at the determined way Ethan scanned the horizon, Florrie knew the greatest challenge had not yet appeared. Chapter 18. The unyielding grip of the frontier. The landscape they traversed grew increasingly rugged and desolate, mirroring the emotional turmoil within the group. Towering mesas, deep canyons, and vast, empty plains stretched out before them, a stark reminder of the unforgiving nature of the frontier. The weather, too, seemed to reflect their inner state, shifting from scorching sun to chilling winds, from clear skies to sudden, violent thunderstorms. Davies pushed them hard, setting a relentless pace, his urgency fueled by the knowledge that the Blackwood gang was likely on their trail. He spoke little, his instructions curt and to the point, his focus unwavering on their survival. He seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to anticipate danger, to sense the presence of their pursuers, to find hidden paths and safe havens. Ethan, despite his lingering doubts about Florrie's past and Davies' intentions, followed Davies' lead, his trust in the agent's expertise overriding his personal reservations. He remained vigilant, his senses on high alert, his rifle always within reach, his protective instincts towards Florrie and Sarah as strong as ever. Sarah, weakened by her injury and haunted by the fear of her husband's retribution, struggled to keep up, her body aching, her spirit flagging. She drew strength from Ethan's quiet support and Florrie's unwavering encouragement, her determination to escape her past and build a new life fueling her resilience. Florrie, caught between the two men, felt the weight of her responsibilities, the burden of her secrets, the constant fear of discovery. She knew she had to prove herself to Ethan, to earn back his trust, to demonstrate her loyalty. She also knew she had to protect Sarah, to help her escape the clutches of the Blackwood gang, to atone for her family's role in Samuel's death. During a brief rest stop, in a narrow canyon sheltered from the wind, Florrie took the opportunity to examine Samuel's journal. She carefully opened the leather-bound book, her fingers tracing the faded ink, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The journal contained detailed notes, observations, and evidence gathered by Samuel during his investigation of the Blackwood gang. Names, dates, locations, descriptions of illegal activities, everything was meticulously documented. Florrie realized the power of the journal, the potential it held to bring down the gang and expose her family's complicity. As she read, she discovered a hidden compartment within the journal, a secret pocket containing a small, folded piece of paper. She carefully unfolded it, her hands trembling, her eyes widening in surprise. It was a letter, addressed to Florrie, from Samuel. She read the letter, her heart aching with a mixture of sadness and regret. Samuel had known about her family's involvement, about her attempts to warn him. He had written the letter in anticipation of his death, entrusting her with a journal, urging her to use it to bring the Blackwood gang to justice. "I know you're not like them, Florrie," the letter read. "I see the good in you, the desire for a different life. Use this journal. Expose the truth. Set yourself free." Florrie felt a surge of emotion, a wave of grief for Samuel, a renewed determination to fulfill his wishes, to honor his memory, to finally break free from the shackles of her past. She showed the letter to Ethan, her eyes filled with tears. He read it, his expression softening, his understanding deepening. He saw the truth in Samuel's words, the confirmation of Florrie's good intentions, the weight of the responsibility she carried. "I believe you, Florrie," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I trust you." He took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. It was a moment of reconciliation, of forgiveness, of renewed love. Davies, observing them, approached, his expression unreadable. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "We're getting close." Close to what? Florrie wondered. Close to safety? Close to danger? Close to the final confrontation with the Blackwood gang? They mounted their horses, continuing their journey, the unyielding grip of the frontier tightening around them. The landscape, the weather, the constant threat of pursuit, all served as a reminder of the challenges they faced, the obstacles they had to overcome. They were riding towards an uncertain future, but they were riding together, their bonds strengthened, their determination renewed. They were ready to face whatever lay ahead, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and hope. Chapter 19. A Promise Made Under a Starless Sky. The somewhere safe that Davies had spoken of turned out to be an abandoned mining town, nestled high in the mountains, a ghost town of crumbling buildings and deserted streets, a place where the wind whistled through broken windows and the silence was broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk. It was a desolate, eerie place, a fitting setting for the final showdown that was brewing. Davies explained that the town, once a thriving center of silver mining, had been abandoned years ago, after a series of cave-ins and a mysterious disappearance of several miners. Locals whispered of curses and ghosts, of restless spirits and hidden dangers. It was a place where secrets were buried, where the past lingered like a shroud. They found shelter in a relatively intact building, a former saloon, its once grand facade now faded and weathered, its interior dusty and filled with cobwebs, its bar long since stripped of its liquor. It was a temporary haven, a place to rest and regroup, to prepare for the inevitable confrontation. Ethan, ever practical, set about securing the building, boarding up windows, reinforcing doors, creating a makeshift fortress. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his movements precise and purposeful, his focus unwavering on their survival. Sarah, despite her injury and exhaustion, helped as best she could, her determination to escape her past fueling her efforts. She cleaned and bandaged her wound, her face pale but resolute, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. Florrie, armed with Samuel's journal and the letter, felt a renewed sense of purpose. She studied the journal, memorizing details, planning strategies, preparing for the moment when she would confront her family's legacy and expose the truth. Davies, meanwhile, remained an enigma. He kept to himself, his thoughts hidden behind a mask of stoicism, his intentions unclear. He spent hours outside the saloon, scouting the area, observing the surrounding landscape, his movements silent and stealthy. He seemed to be waiting for something or someone. As night fell, a starless sky blanketed the ghost town, casting long, dark shadows, creating an atmosphere of unease and anticipation. The wind howled through the empty streets, a mournful sound that echoed the loneliness and despair of the abandoned town. Ethan and Flory stood outside the saloon, looking out at the darkness, their bodies close, their hands clasped together. They spoke little, their thoughts filled with the challenges ahead, the uncertainties that lay before them. "Do you think we'll make it?" Flory asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes searching Ethan's. Ethan looked at her, his gaze filled with a mixture of love and determination. "We have to," he said, his voice firm. "We have to survive. For us. For Sarah. For Samuel." He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. He kissed her, a long, passionate kiss that spoke of their love, their commitment, their shared hope for a future free from the shadows of the past. "I love you, Flory," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I'll always protect you." "I love you too, Ethan," Flory replied, her voice trembling.
"And I'll always stand by you."
They stood there, in the darkness, under the starless sky, their love a beacon of hope in the desolate landscape. They had made a promise to each other, a vow to survive, to fight, to build a new life together. Suddenly, a flicker of movement in the distance caught Ethan's eye. He stiffened, his senses instantly alert, his hand reaching for his rifle. "What is it?" Flory asked, her voice filled with alarm. Ethan pointed towards a distant ridge, where a faint light flickered, then disappeared. "Someone's out there," he said, his voice low and tense. "Watching us." Davies emerged from the saloon, his expression grim. "It's them," he said, his voice confirming Ethan's suspicion. "The Blackwood gang. They've found us." Flory's heart sank. She had, in her heart, suspected this temporary peace would be broken. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The news that the Blackwood gang had found them sent a wave of tension through the small group. The fragile peace of the abandoned mining town was shattered, replaced by the imminent threat of violence. The final confrontation, long anticipated, was now upon them. Ethan, his face set in a grim mask, immediately took charge, his years of experience on the frontier kicking in. He directed Flory and Sarah to take cover inside the saloon, positioning them behind the thick, wooden bar, the safest place in the building. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice firm but calm. "Don't come out unless I tell you." Flory and Sarah nodded, their faces pale, their eyes filled with fear, but also with a steely determination. They would not cower. They would fight if necessary. Ethan and Davies positioned themselves near the entrance of the saloon, their rifles raised, their bodies tense, their senses on high alert. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they were not outmatched. They had courage, skill, and the burning desire for justice on their side. The silence of the ghost town was broken by the sound of approaching horses, their hooves echoing through the empty streets, their riders' voices a chorus of menace. The Blackwood gang, led by Sarah's husband, had arrived. A voice, harsh and cruel, shattered the stillness. "Sarah,
Come out."
you can't hide from me." It was her husband's voice, the voice that haunted her nightmares, the voice that represented all the pain and suffering she had endured. Sarah, huddled behind the bar with Flory, trembled, her body shaking with fear, but she did not speak. She would not surrender. She would not go back to him. "We're not coming out." Ethan shouted back, his voice defiant. "You want her, you'll have to go through us." A volley of gunfire erupted, bullets ripping through the wooden facade of the saloon, splintering wood, shattering glass. The battle had begun. Ethan and Davies returned fire, their shots precise and deadly, their movements coordinated and efficient. They were skilled marksmen, their years of experience evident in their every action. Flory, peering over the top of the bar, saw the figures of the outlaws moving through the streets, their rifles blazing, their faces contorted with rage and hatred. She recognized Sarah's husband, a tall, imposing man with a cruel face and cold, dead eyes. She raised her own rifle, her finger on the trigger, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to protect Ethan, protect Sarah, protect herself. She had to fight. The battle raged, a chaotic symphony of gunfire and shouts, of splintering wood and shattering glass. The saloon shook under the assault, the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and smoke. Florrie saw one of the outlaws, a young man with a desperate look in his eyes, attempting to flank the saloon, to enter through a side window. She aimed and fired, her shot hitting its mark. The man stumbled, falling to the ground. She felt a surge of conflicting emotions, a mixture of horror and relief, of guilt and satisfaction. She had taken a life, but she had also defended herself, defended her friends. The gunfire continued, relentless and unforgiving. Ethan and Davies fought bravely, their skill and courage holding the outlaws at bay, but they were slowly being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a figure Florrie recognized. It was her brother, the man who had hired Samuel, the man who represented everything she had run away from. He was leading a group of men, armed and ready to fight. But they weren't fighting with the Blackwood gang. They were fighting against them. Florrie's brother, seeing her, shouted, his voice filled with a mixture of surprise and relief. "Florrie, are you all right?" Florrie nodded, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her brother, her family, had come to help her. The arrival of Florrie's brother and his men turned the tide of the battle. The Blackwood gang, caught between two forces, was quickly overwhelmed. Sarah's husband, seeing his men falling, his plans crumbling, attempted to escape, but Ethan intercepted him, his rifle aimed at the man's heart. "It's over," Ethan said, his voice cold and hard. Sarah's husband glared at Ethan, his eyes filled with hatred, but he knew he was defeated. He lowered his weapon, his body slumping in surrender. The battle was over. The Blackwood gang was defeated. Sarah was free. Florrie emerged from the saloon, her body trembling, her eyes filled with tears. She saw Ethan, standing over Sarah's husband, his rifle still raised, his face grim. She saw her brother, approaching her, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. "Florrie," her brother said, his voice filled with emotion.
"I'm sorry."
"For everything." Florrie looked at him, her heart filled with a mixture of anger and forgiveness. She had run away from her family, from their corruption, from their way of life. But they had come to help her, to save her. "It's all right," she said, her voice soft. "It's over now." She turned to Ethan, her love for him overflowing. He lowered his rifle, his face softening, his eyes meeting hers.
They had survived.
They had won. They were together. The final confrontation had been a reckoning of hearts and horizons. The past had collided with the present, secrets had been revealed, loyalties had been tested, and love had endured. The frontier, with its unyielding grip, had shaped them, challenged them, and ultimately set them free. The sun began to rise, painting the sky with colors of hope and new beginnings. Epilogue. The aftermath of the battle at the ghost town was a period of healing and rebuilding, of reckoning with the past and embracing the future. The surviving members of the Blackwood gang were handed over to the authorities, their reign of terror finally brought to an end. Sarah, free from her husband's control, began the long process of recovering from her physical and emotional wounds, supported by Florrie and Ethan. Agent Davies, his mission accomplished, departed as quietly as he had arrived, taking Samuel's journal with him, promising to ensure that justice was served. He remained a figure of mystery, his true identity and motivations still shrouded in secrecy, a reminder of the complex and often hidden forces at play in the vast and unforgiving frontier. Florrie's brother, having redeemed himself by aiding in the defeat of the Blackwood gang, returned to his family, promising to use his influence to reform the mining company's practices, to atone for the past, and build a more ethical future. The rift between Florrie and her family began to heal, a fragile bridge built over the chasm of their past differences. Ethan and Florrie, their love deepened and strengthened by the trials they had endured, decided to stay in the abandoned mining town, to rebuild it, to create a new life together. They saw the potential in the desolate place, the opportunity to create a haven, a community built on trust, respect, and resilience. They worked side by side, restoring the old saloon, transforming it into a home, a gathering place, a symbol of hope and renewal. They invited other settlers to join them, offering land and opportunity, attracting people seeking a fresh start, a chance to build a better life. The town slowly came back to life, its streets once again filled with the sounds of children playing, of horses' hooves, of hammers and saws, of laughter and conversation. It was a slow, arduous process, but it was filled with purpose, with a sense of community, with the promise of a brighter future. Ethan and Flory, their love a beacon in the revitalized town, married under a vast, open sky, surrounded by the friends they had made, the community they had built. It was a simple ceremony filled with heartfelt vows, with tears of joy, with the promise of a lifetime together. Years passed, and the town thrived, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of love, and the enduring allure of the frontier. Ethan and Flory, their hair streaked with silver, their faces etched with the lines of time and experience, remained at the heart of the community, their love a constant source of strength and inspiration. They often sat on the porch of their home, the old saloon, watching the sunset paint the sky with vibrant colors, reminiscing about their past, their adventures, the challenges they had overcome. They remembered Sarah, who had moved on to build a new life for herself, her past a distant memory, her future filled with hope. They remembered Agent Davies, the enigmatic figure who had played a crucial role in their survival, his fate unknown. They remembered Samuel, the Pinkerton agent who had given his life in the pursuit of justice, his memory honored by the town's renewed spirit. And they remembered the storm that had brought them together, the cabin that had sheltered them, the secrets that had threatened to tear them apart, and the love that had ultimately prevailed. They had found their place in the world, their home in each other's arms, their future stretching out before them, a vast and open horizon filled with promise and possibility. The frontier had tested them, challenged them, and ultimately rewarded them with a love that was as strong and enduring as the land itself. Their story had no neat, tidy ending because life on the frontier never did. It was a continuous cycle of hardship and joy, of loss and renewal, of challenges met and overcome. But through it all, their love remained, a constant beacon, guiding them through the darkness and illuminating their path towards a brighter tomorrow. They lived simply. They lived well. The end.